Upper St. Clair, an oral history, is brought to you by your friends and neighbors at the Community Foundation of Upper St. Clair, the Upper St. Clair Township Historical Society, and the students and staff of the Upper St. Clair School District.
And he spit out the window, and I had a white shirt on, and it came right all over my face and my shirt.
We don't need a sister. She'll just be in the way, and what's more, she's a sissy, they all were heard to say. They wanted to have me exchanged the moment that I cried, for girls were just a nuisance, and that couldn't be denied.
I could tell you a story about Jack that I would want to tell on television.
We helped all the way from Beating down there to Clifton to see the plane crash. And they had it all roped off, and Jack Clancher carried how many bodies off the plane, I don't remember.
Well, I knew Chief Clancher pretty well. I'll tell you what.
45 on the ship.
He was an honest man.
I took the pledge, if we ever got through this depression, I would never eat another turnip. Never would I ever eat another turnip.
The water seems to have gathered itself in all its power to McLaughlin Run, a small stream which enters into the Chartiers Creek, running through Bridgeville and Sodom. During the heavy rains, the run assumed unwanted proportions and rushing down with augmented power, playing sad havoc with the quiet homesteads upon its banks.
Upper St. Clair saw one of its blackest and darkest days in the late 1800s, when what has become known as the Great Storm hit the township. The storm and the resulting flood took the lives of many Upper St. Clair residents and caused some of the worst destruction ever in the township. It was July 26, 1874. According to reports of the time, it was the perfect storm and the worst that anyone in the region had seen. The storm blew in suddenly, hitting just after 8 o'clock in the evening. The storm caught the residents by surprise. It was a unique combination of meteorological events that made the storm so fierce. According to newspaper reports, 2 separate storms, one from the southeast and one from the northwest, were on a collision course. When they met, the sky opened up and the havoc began. The rain fell hard and fast. Soon small streams had overflowed their banks. The smaller streams of water ran into the bigger streams, and they filled McLaughlin Run. It grew into a huge torrent of water and swept through the valley. In the 1870s, the McLaughlin Run Valley was populated mainly by farmers and coal miners. They could only stand and watch as their homes were washed away. This picture shows the settlement of Clifton before the Great Storm. McLaughlin Run went through the center of the village. The wagon shop, run by John Pellet, was built just 3 months before the Great Storm. Eyewitnesses reported seeing horses, cows, and barns being swept downstream. There are even reports that the anvil from the blacksmith shop was swept into the raging river and carried towards Bridgeville. A number of people, sometimes whole families, were killed by the rushing water. The Pittsburgh Gazette reported that 3 different families in Upper St. Clair were washed away and killed in the flood. 5 other houses located along McLaughlin Run were completely destroyed, but the families escaped. They lost everything to the water: furnishings, livestock, and farm equipment.
They were filled with a downpouring flood until each contained a roaring river, carrying everything before it: buildings, their contents, corpses of human beings, dead animals of every description, horses, cattle, hogs, sheep, mules, household furniture, mountains of clay, sand, gravel, street lamps, fences, etc., etc., all borne upon its raging bosom towards the river below. It was a terrific visitation, and should be a most solemn warning to the people teaching them not to neglect the necessary precautions and to never disregard the possible power of the elements.
The storm didn't just hit Upper St. Clair. It affected the rest of Allegheny County as well. The final account of the storm left 150 people dead. The damage was estimated at several $millions. Some segments of the Oral History Project are best told by the people who lived them. Such is the case with Eleanor Boyce Holstein. Eleanor was the only girl and the youngest in a family of 5 boys. Her family lived near Boyce Station in a house dubbed the Elephant House because it was so large. Growing up with 5 brothers had a profound influence on Eleanor. She recorded her experiences in a poem entitled The Only Girl. Eleanor was born on Election Day in 1915, and 21 years later, on Election Day in 1936, she wrote the poem while attending Grove City College.
To be the only girl in a family of 6 is certainly calamitous and puts one in a fix. To 1915, let's go back, it was on Election Day, and Nursey said to all the boys, now run on out and play. And when it came their bedtime and their minds were all a-twirl, the nurse told them the secret, and then came, shucks, a girl. We don't need a sister, she'll just be in the way, and what's more, she's a sissy, they all were heard to say. They wanted to have me exchange the moment that I cried, for girls were just a nuisance, and that couldn't be denied. But then when they discovered no exchanges could be made, they guessed that they could stand me, but would teach me games they played. So of course I learned to tackle, how to put on gloves and box, how to hold a bat and throw a ball, and withstand all the shocks. But one day Mother told me it wasn't very nice for little girls to play rough games, so I of course took her advice. I learned to make doll dresses, and even how to cook, and to spend my leisure moments in a corner reading books. Of teasing, I took plenty. It was always 5 to 1. I didn't even stand a chance, nor was it any fun. But of course, we've all grown up now, and I can truly say 'twas fun to have 5 brothers, and I'll take more any day.
Jack Clancher may be the closest thing Upper St. Clair has to a legend. He was vital to the township in so many ways that his life cannot be completely covered in just one section of the Oral History Project. To start, we will introduce you to Jack Clancher as many people encountered him. Chief Clancher of the Upper St. Clair Police Department. Most people say Chief Clancher was the Upper St. Clair Police Department. Jack Clancher held many different offices and elected positions in Upper St. Clair. He was Justice of the Peace, a constable, and a township commissioner. But his most indelible mark was on the police department. Jack Clancher was the first policeman in Upper St. Clair. His original title was constable. This was an elected position that allowed him to serve warrants and conduct police business anywhere in the state. Clancher was elected as a constable 4 times from 1939 to 1955. Clancher started working for the USC Police Department on January 2nd, 1940. He served as the only police officer in Upper St. Clair for 12 years. By most accounts, Jack Clancher was a tough but fair man who had an affinity for the job.
He did so many nice things for Upper St. Clair. He was a wonderful chief of police, and he was very proud of his job.
They just trusted Jack so much. They gave him keys to their home.
Yes.
Never any question about his honesty.
He was a one-man police department.
Oh, yeah.
One-man police department. And he ran this place pretty good.
As long as Jack was chief of police, he never pointed his revolver at anybody. He could handle a situation.
One thing is fairly certain. Jack Clancher did not take the job for the money. In his first year, he made $35 a month as the only police officer. Clancher, however, had to supply his own uniform, weapons, car, and he even paid for the gasoline. The Clancher House at many times functioned as the community police station. He was on duty 24 hours a day. His only break came on weekends. Bill Burster, better known as the longtime tax collector for USC, worked as a constable, filling in for Clancher.
And for $10, I worked every weekend as a constable. And he gave me a gun. I could hit the side of a building with it.
Jack Clancher's unique uniform made him a very recognizable figure. Originally, he wore a typical police hat with a short brim. He wore special pants called jodhpurs that had flared legs, and he wore puttees, a leather covering over the lower leg. Around the time Jack Clancher's title changed from constable to Upper St. Clair police officer, his uniform changed as well. To the people that knew him, this is the uniform that identified Jack Clancher. He wore this campaign hat for the remainder of his career.
He told me that it was his choice, and most people identify the Pennsylvania State Police with the campaign hat, and he always told me that he had his campaign hat before they changed their uniform. His first uniform was always with the riding pants with the leather.
Putties. Putties?
They're called putties.
Putties,
the leggings or whatever. And he didn't wear a shirt or tie, but his top part of his uniform was military type neck.
Gray shirt.
Because he said he chose that style because when he would get a call during the night, it didn't take a lot of time for him to dress with shirt and tie in order to respond.
Jack Clancher had no formal police training when he started working for the township. Even so, within a few years, he proved to be indispensable to Upper St. Clair. The township supervisors used that exact wording in this letter to the draft board in 1943. They were asking for Clancher to be deferred from military service. He was a constable and a police officer for the township, and they felt they couldn't do without him.
We feel, in view of the fact that our experience in the past with other police officers has proved very much a failure, that Mr. Clancher's services to the township is indispensable. He is not only serving as the elected constable of the township, but is also serving as the police officer of our township by the approval of the courts of Allegheny County. We wish to point out that it is quite difficult to train one for this office, even though there is someone available. To train an officer, it requires 6 months to a year due to the fact that the officer is required to know each individual family located in the township and his or her place of residence. Being unlike that of boroughs or townships of congested areas where house numbers are available, our police officer must rely on individual names or roads, as quite a large populace live on farms where directions are given as roads only. Let me cite one incident. The officer is called to make an emergency call to deliver a patient to the hospital. His only direction is to call at Mr. Smith's home on Cook Road. You can see what an untrained officer would be confronted with if he were not familiar with the residents of this township.
Jack Clancher would drive down the road and stop and see out in the lawn or out in the barn or someplace. He'd stop and come in and talk. And we didn't have anybody from outside the community come. Jack Clancher would have caught him anyway. He knew everybody. He'd have caught him if there had been anybody from outside the township in there.
Jack Clancher's training caught up with his experience after World War II. In April of 1946, he attended the FBI's National Academy in Washington, D.C. His graduating class included law enforcement from around the country and was led by the nation's #1 cop, J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover is pictured here for the FBI's 32nd National Police Academy graduating class, just down from Jack Clancher. The two men may not have known it, but their lives were surprisingly similar. For nearly half a century, J. Edgar Hoover and the Federal Bureau of Investigation were indistinguishable. The same can be said for Jack Clancher and the Upper St. Clair Police Department. The only difference is that while Hoover had plenty of G-men helping him, Clancher was a one-man police force. Jack Clancher had an encyclopedic knowledge of the law. He worked for the FBI teaching courses on police work to officers from surrounding areas. He could recite the vehicle code from memory.
Over the years, his knowledge of law enforcement was fantastic. I've had police officers say to me, he knew the motor vehicle code from cover to cover because he didn't even have to look. He could tell you what page it was on. His reputation was he would stand there and tell them, page 52 is section, 32A or whatever, and he would never look at the book.
It seems that everybody that knew Clancher knows a story about him or at least has an opinion of him.
I knew Chief Clancher pretty well. I'll tell you what.
45 on his hip.
He was an honest man. I don't care what they talk about him. You couldn't get away with anything. I don't care if you were a justice of peace or one of the commissioners. If it was your turn, you got it.
That's right. Yeah.
He was honest.
And he was
He went to the law.
And he was tough. He would bang heads. I've seen him take on a half a dozen of those young guys there. He had no fear of man or beast. He was the law and order in Upper St. Clair Township, and everybody knew it.
He was respected by a lot of other police, though.
After hearing from people that knew Jack Clancher, it is apparent that he is an Upper St. Clair legend. He was the law and order of Upper St. Clair. He was respected and trusted, and an excellent policeman.
I got a call one Sunday to come down to a certain area where a person had a gun. I went down, and I was never so glad to see Jack Clancher come in my life as he was, because I didn't know what to do. I didn't know whether to take her in or what. I didn't know what to do, so someone said, "Here comes Jack." I said, "Thank God for that."
Jack Clancher was much more than a police chief. He worked and cared for his community in many different ways. He was an innovator and an electrician, and he combined those abilities into some unique creations. His ideas meant better and sometimes safer lives for people in Upper St. Clair. We'll take a look at some of the better-known and some lesser-known changes that were the work of Jack Clancher. September of 1969 began a new school year and a new school building for Upper St. Clair, as the boys' school opened. This presented a new problem: how to get the boys' students across busy Route 19 safely without slowing traffic. The students were crossing from the development of St. Clair Acres and walking up to the newly constructed boys' school. Controlling the traffic light by hand was time-consuming and traffic would back up. The problem was solved by Jack Clancher. The story goes that he was watching TV and using a remote control. He realized the same electronics could be used for the traffic light. So he built a receiver for the light and gave the remote transmitter to the crossing guard. Now the guard could cross the students and then change the light back to green, saving time for motorists while still keeping students safe. The idea was such a success that traffic engineers for the state decided that they might be able to use the same technology other places. When the new township building was completed, it was the first time Upper St. Clair had a police headquarters and a jail. The jail cells were in the basement, and the police department offices were on the first floor. That meant that officers would have to go downstairs every half hour to check on prisoners, as was required by federal law. The light bulb went on in Jack Clancher's head, and a TV went on at the police station. Clancher wired the township building so that cameras in the jail cell area could be monitored on TV by officers upstairs. That meant around-the-clock supervision of prisoners and more efficient use of time for police officers. According to Clancher and the Pennsylvania Department of Justice, the closed-circuit TV system was the first of its kind for law enforcement. He even used his police duties to help feed people. The newspaper snapped this picture of Chief Clancher bringing in the dough. The deer had been struck by a car on Washington Road, and Chief Clancher brought it to Southside Hospital to help ease a meat shortage. Jack Clancher spent his off-duty hours working as an electrician. He repaired TV sets, radios, and manufactured hearing aid equipment. He originally did similar work for the hearing aid company E.A. Myers. He also used his skill to help others. Clancher spent time with hearing-impaired students at the DePaul Institute in Brookline. He designed and built special hearing devices from radio parts.
He would take at that time we had radios that were consoles, and he would put the amplifier in this to amplify, and had wires going to headphones for each child, and there were 3 to a stand, and each child had their own control knob, because apparently the hearing loss was not the same in every child.
Clancher never received any pay for his work at the DePaul Institute, but he spent much of his free time creating these devices and maintaining them.
And when the instrument would break, and we would get a call, and at some point in time he would go up and walk into the room, the children would just sit there and go like this to him. Hers was broken or his was broken.
The hearing devices allowed students to hear the teacher and later to hear TV programs.
When television first came out, that was in the very late 40s. And in the early 50s, Jack was very involved with DePaul and the children. And he had made friends with M.M. Smith, who lived here in the township. And M.M. Smith was a very charitable man. And he had a business downtown. And Jack was talking to him one day and said, you know, I'm up at DePaul and, you know, television's coming in now. I think I know how to really entertain these children. So it must have intrigued M.M. Smith, because he said to Jack, Jack, if you do this, you go ahead and buy a television set and do this for the kids. I'll pay for it. And Jack did. And he took it up to DePaul and set it up, and they had probably, we would call it a recreation room, you know, had all the students in there. And he took the stands with the ear headphones that each child had and set them all up. And when he plugged in the television,
They could.
do you know how the children responded? Because they're sitting there, they didn't hear anything, and all of a sudden they hear something, And they made the association with the picture on the tube. And it was a cowboy movie. And he said, and the little boys were going, bang, bang.
Sometimes Jack Clancher's police work intersected with his electrician's goodwill. Jack Clancher received a call from Annie Williams. Her house still stands today located on Highland Road, within view of Route 19. The Williams home was built in 1845. Her house had no electricity, and it was said to be like living in the 1800s when it was 1943. She called Chief Clancher and told him that someone had broken into her home and was taking her food.
So he went down and, like I have said, she had gas lights, lamps, whatever. Yeah. And probably her eyesight was failing because Jack said when he looked, he could see that perhaps there was a mouse or two that was eating some of her food. So he was very kind to her, did not divulge that he thought her eyesight, was bad. And he just said to her, Annie, I think you need an electric light. And he put an electric light in her kitchen so she could see better. That solved that problem.
Jack Clancher inspired trust in the residents of Upper St. Clair. Annie Williams had so much faith in him that she made him executor of her will. She also gave Jack Clancher the deed to her cemetery plot with special instructions.
She said, Jack, I want you to have this cemetery deed because you have to make sure I'm buried in the right place.
Jack Clancher made his mark on another community safety force. He was one of the founding members of the Upper St. Clair Volunteer Fire Department. Jack Clancher was an innovator who brought about positive change in his community, and he found solutions to problems.
And during the time that there was the damage to the municipal building and the mine subsidence, and they had to vacate the building, Jack volunteered our basement facilities, and he put up a radio antenna on our home to receive the calls. So his dedication was to Upper St. Clair.
Although the tangible reminders of Jack Clancher's time are gone, including the house where he lived, the life and times of Jack Clancher have left an indelible mark on his community. In the 1930s, commercial air travel was still in its infancy. A fledgling airline company called Transcontinental and Western Air Incorporated was one of the innovators in this new market for airline passengers. The most popular passenger plane of the time was the DC-2, made by the Douglas Company. The DC-2 was the first airplane that was fast enough and comfortable enough to draw passengers. Its development helped save the floundering U.S. airline companies. But with the emergence of the airline travel industry came inevitable misfortunes. One of the darkest days for the new airlines was March 25, 1937. It was shortly after 6 p.m. when Flight 15A plummeted out of the sky and crashed nose first into the ground. It hit the ground near the present-day YMCA building on McMurray Road and stuck there with its tail in the air. The impact killed all 13 people on board. The plane had left Newark, New Jersey. Its destination was the Allegheny County Municipal Airport. Eyewitnesses said the plane struggled to stay level, spun to the left, and then dived straight into the ground. The resulting sound brought people out of their homes to see what had happened. C.D. Pellett's family was having Sunday dinner when they heard the thud from the crash.
Seemed to be a funny noise and commotion on the road, and one of my cousins ran out. We were in the midst of dinner, ran out to see what was the matter, and he come in, he was all white, and he said that an airplane just crashed in the field up the road. Of course, that ended that dinner.
Residents watched in horror as the bodies of the 3 crew members and 10 passengers were pulled from the plane and laid out on the ground.
I was just a kid. I was on crutches with this bad leg in my head, and we helped all the way from Beating down there to Clifton to see the plane crash. and they had it all roped off, and Jack Clancher carried how many bodies off the plane, I don't remember.
The cause of the crash was never determined, but a report by the Bureau of Air Commerce stated the probable cause was a heavy accumulation of ice on the wingtips, which rendered the plane uncontrollable. Even though TWA was cleared of blame, they apparently still worried about bad press from the incident. In this early picture of the wreckage, the TWA logo is visible on the tail. In later pictures, however, the TWA has been painted over. No one is sure who did the touch-up job. The incident may have been a scary start for commercial airline travel, but the crash would not stop the airline industry from taking off. Even C.D. Pellet, who watched bodies being carried from the plane, ended up working for an airline company.
Of course, everybody had passed away, and it was a very sad fear. I thought at the time I would never ride an airplane. However, I worked for an airline for 39 years.
6 years later, on another Sunday, a military plane crash caught the attention of St. Clair residents when this U.S. Army B-17 went down. This time, it did not happen in the township of Upper St. Clair. It crashed in present-day South Fayette Township. Louis DeLatch, a St. Clair resident, shot this 8mm film, and it's the only known film of this crash. There's a great story and a happier ending for this crew. The crew was on a routine flight when 2 of the engines failed and the order was given to bail out. 4 of the men on board made it out the door and parachuted to safety. Unfortunately, as the remaining 4 headed for the exit, Lieutenant Eugene Gardner caught his parachute on a lever and it opened prematurely. Lieutenant Gardner, a navigator, told the pilots to, quote, "leave me to my fate." In a heroic turn, the men decided to stay with Gardner and ride the plane in. The choice was a dangerous one because the plane was loaded down with fuel. A short time later, they successfully belly landed the plane and escaped just before the plane caught fire and completely burned, leaving just the wreckage behind. The pilot's decision saved Lieutenant Gardner's life and earned them recognition for their bravery, not to mention his undying gratitude.